Walk into any liquor store and you'll count dozens of whiskey brands. Different names, different founding dates, different price points. It feels like a competitive market. It isn't. Two corporations, Diageo and Beam Suntory, control roughly 60% of those brand names, generating over $40 billion a year in combined revenue. The heritage on the label, the craft language, the century-old founding dates, much of it is carefully constructed architecture. And the real distance between a $30 bottle and a $120 one may have nothing to do with what's actually inside. Rows of whiskey bottles stretch across the shelves, each label promising a different story. Names like Bulleit, Johnnie Walker, Maker's Mark, and Knob Creek compete for attention. Some boast Scottish ancestry, others Kentucky roots, a few claim family recipes, or frontier grit. The packaging leans heavily on tradition, aged casks, hand-lettered fonts, sepia photographs, and founding dates reaching back to the 1800s. It's a visual chorus of independence and authenticity, crafted to make the aisle feel crowded with choice. A closer look tells a different story. Many of these so-called rivals share the same parent company. Bulleit and Johnnie Walker fall under Diageo, a British conglomerate that produces around 40% of all Scotch whiskey. Jim Beam and Maker's Mark belong to Beam Suntory, a Japanese-owned powerhouse with a deep hold on American bourbon. Even as labels tout local roots and family heritage, their profits flow up to corporate headquarters continents away. Whiskey critic Jim Murray once remarked that, for all the talk of craftsmanship, what matters most is what's in the glass, not the story on the label. Yet in most stores, the story is what dominates. Limited editions, gold medals, and hand-numbered bottles drive prices higher, but the liquid inside often comes from the same industrial-scale facilities, following standardized recipes designed for consistency above all else. Brand variety on the shelf is real, but the independence behind it is often an illusion. The architecture of choice is built on heritage language and clever marketing, not on competition or diversity of ownership. The question lingers. When you pick up a bottle, are you choosing a unique product or just a different costume from the same cast? Paul Finley, an industry analyst, lays out the numbers that cut through the haze of branding. Diageo alone produces about 40% of all Scotch whiskey worldwide, operating more than 24 distilleries across Scotland. This isn't just about a handful of flagship names, Johnnie Walker, Lagavulin, Talisker, but a network that reaches into nearly every corner of the Scotch category. Their global spirits portfolio, spanning over 200 brands, brings in more than $20 billion in annual net sales as of 2025. Yet Scotch is just one part of the picture. Beam Suntory, the other major player, sits at the heart of American bourbon. After acquiring Jim Beam in 2014 for $16 billion from Fortune Brands, Suntory gained control of Maker's Mark, Knob Creek, and Basil Hayden. Their reach extends into Japanese whiskey with Yamazaki and Hibiki, and they maintain a strong presence in global bourbon sales. While precise numbers for Beam Suntory are harder to pin down since it's privately owned, industry estimates place their global spirits share at around 6 to 10%, with bourbon dominance in the U.S. market. Combined, Diageo and Beam Suntory account for roughly a quarter to a third of all global spirit sales by value. In Scotch, Diageo's 40% share dwarfs most competitors. In bourbon, Beam Suntory's brands fill a similar role on the American shelf. The 60% figure often cited in marketing circles is an exaggeration, but the reality is still striking. A handful of corporations quietly shape what appears to be a diverse market. Illusion of choice is maintained by keeping legacy names alive and letting the stories on the bottle do the talking, while the real decisions are made in boardrooms continents away. Diageo and Beam Suntory are not just names behind the labels, they represent the financial muscle driving much of the global whiskey market. Together, their annual sales in spirits approach $25 billion, with Diageo alone reporting over $20 billion in net sales for fiscal year 2025 across more than 200 brands. Beam Suntory, while privately held and less transparent, is estimated to add another $4 to $5 billion with its bourbon and Japanese whiskey portfolios anchoring its global reach. Beneath the familiar logos and heritage stories, the real ownership map is drawn by institutional investors. As of mid-2025, about 82% of Diageo's shares are held by major financial institutions, firms like Capital Research, Massachusetts Financial, Vanguard, and BlackRock. No single entity dominates, but the combined effect is clear. Profit expectations and shareholder returns shape every decision, from acquisition strategy to marketing spend. The company's market capitalization hovers around $52 billion. Beam Suntory, as part of Suntory Holdings, sits in the hands of a Japanese parent company and its institutional backers, with the founding family retaining a legacy stake. This concentration of financial power is not just an accounting detail, it is the engine behind the illusion of choice. When a consumer picks up a bottle of Johnnie Walker, Bulleit, or Jim Beam, the revenue flows up to a handful of corporate headquarters and ultimately to a network of global investors. The pressure to deliver steady growth incentivizes strategies that keep old brand names alive, emphasize craft and scarcity, and obscure the true scale of consolidation. The result is a marketplace where the appearance of competition masks a tightly held economic structure, and where the stories on the bottle are designed as much for Wall Street as for the whiskey aisle. Old names on new bottles tell a story that's rarely true. When Diageo revived Bulleit Bourbon in 1997, the label leaned heavily on the legend of Augustus Bulliet, a 19th century distiller. But the modern Bulleit recipe and production came from a corporate boardroom, not a frontier still. The brand's 1830s claim sits front and center, while its real rebirth traces to the late 1990s, after Diageo's acquisition and repositioning. The bottle's design, vintage glass, hand-stamped fonts, serves as a stage set, not a family heirloom. Old Forester, another storied bourbon, claims roots in 1870. Yet its current incarnation owes more to Brown-Forman's 1999 relaunch than to any unbroken lineage. After decades of changing hands and recipes, the label's promise of America's first bottled bourbon is preserved, but the context is lost. The distillery's real history includes closures, corporate mergers, and recipe changes that rarely make it into the marketing copy. Even brands that disappeared for half a century can return overnight. Old Rippy, once shuttered in 1950, now reappears on shelves as part of Campari's Whiskey Barons collection, distilled at the Wild Turkey site. The label boasts Est 1868, although the family distillery vanished generations ago. The revival's success depends on nostalgia and the power of a good backstory, not on any direct line to the past. Brian McNeil, a whiskey historian, has spent years tracing the paper trail behind these brands. His archival findings reveal a consistent pattern: acquisition by conglomerates, followed by a careful resurrection of historic labels. The founding dates stay, the family legends are dusted off, but the real continuity is financial, not familial. Heritage becomes a marketing asset, stripped from its context and repackaged for the modern shelf. For consumers, the gap between what's promised and what's poured grows wider with every new revival. Federal regulations in the United States require whiskey labels to list the bottler or distiller, but they stop short of demanding clear disclosure of who actually owns the brand. The Alcohol and Tobacco Tax and Trade Bureau, or TTB, enforces rules about age statements and production location. Yet the parent company's name is almost never required on the front of the bottle. The result is a regulatory blind spot that allows multinational corporations to maintain the illusion of independence across dozens of familiar brands. Shoppers see stories about family founders and local roots, not the reality of a global portfolio managed from Tokyo or London. Behind the curtain, the real story of what is in the bottle often starts far from the label's promised birthplace. In Lawrenceburg, Indiana, a massive facility operated by MGP Ingredients produces rye and bourbon whiskey at industrial scale. MGP's output doesn't land on shelves under its own name. Instead, it flows into more than 70 different brands, many of which market themselves as small batch, craft, or even family run. The same whiskey can show up in bottles ranging from $30 to $120, depending on the story printed on the label and the packaging it's poured into. Greg Lenz, a former MGP insider, describes the process in blunt terms. A brand can select a mash bill, specify an age, and purchase thousands of gallons of whiskey with only minor tweaks. The resulting products are often chemically identical, separated only by marketing, bottle shape, and price tag. For consumers, the difference between a so-called craft rye and a mass market label might be little more than a wax seal and a backstory. The price gap, however, can be dramatic, sometimes fourfold, for whiskey sourced from the same tanks. The Federal Trade Commission has issued occasional warnings about misleading claims, but enforcement is rare. As long as the distillery location and age are accurate, the illusion of independence holds. The label might promise a frontier recipe or a family tradition, but the liquid inside could come from the same source as dozens of its supposed rivals. In this marketplace, branding is often the only real distinction. Inside Kentucky, a network of more than 24 distilleries forms the backbone of Diageo's and Beam Suntory's control. These companies don't just own the brands, they own the means of production, the warehouses, and the routes to store shelves. National distribution deals give their products prime placement, while the three-tier system, producers, distributors, retailers, locks out most smaller players. Dan McIntyre, a former distributor executive, describes how major brands secure exclusive agreements. Retailers get incentives for stocking the best-known labels, and distributors prioritize volume from the giants. For independent distilleries, breaking through these barriers means higher costs, limited shelf space, and a constant fight for visibility. Price is where the illusion deepens. The same whiskey, sourced from a facility like MGP in Indiana, can appear under dozens of different labels. Some bottles are sold as craft, others as premium, but the liquid inside is often chemically indistinguishable. Dr. Rachel Chia's recent analysis compared multiple brands claiming small batch or artisanal status. Her lab found that in blind tests, the chemical profiles matched within a few percentage points, yet the price tags ranged from $30 to $120, a fourfold gap justified by little more than packaging and story. Vertical integration lets the big players control every step, from grain to glass. They can drive down production costs, but the savings rarely reach the consumer. Instead, marketing leans on scarcity, heritage, and exclusivity to push prices higher. For independents, the economics are reversed. Smaller scale means higher costs, but without the distribution muscle or marketing budget to command premium pricing. The result is a marketplace where the illusion of choice is propped up by infrastructure, and where the price you pay often reflects the power of the brand, not the quality of the whiskey. Inside the world of American whiskey, a handful of producers remain truly independent. Buffalo Trace, owned by the Sazerac Company, stands out for its vertical integration, controlling every step from grain selection to bottling. This approach allows Buffalo Trace to maintain transparency in sourcing, aging, and blending, sidestepping the need for outside suppliers or contract distilling. Matt McCarthy, a veteran at the distillery, describes the challenge of holding onto autonomy while competing against conglomerates that dominate distribution networks and advertising budgets. Willett Distillery, still family-owned, faces a different set of hurdles. Mike Willett, part of the current generation, points to the constant struggle for shelf space. Without the backing of a national distributor, Willett relies on regional partners and word of mouth to reach consumers. The company's small scale means higher production costs per bottle, but also a hands-on approach to every batch. For Willett, the story on the label matches the reality in the warehouse, a rare alignment in today's market. Heaven Hill, another independent, is one of the country's largest family-owned distilleries. The The Shapira family has kept control since 1935, weathering decades of mergers and market shifts. Heaven Hill's independence allows it to experiment with new mash bills and aging techniques, but it also means navigating a market where corporate giants can outspend and outmaneuver smaller players at every turn. These distilleries prove that independence is possible, but it comes with constant challenges. Distribution remains the biggest barrier. Without access to the biggest networks, even well-made whiskey can struggle to find its audience. The economics of scale favor the giants, but for some, the integrity of true integrity is worth the fight. A bottle of bourbon on a Kentucky shelf often carries an American flag or a family crest, but the profits may end up in Tokyo or London. That disconnect is not just trivia, it's a blind spot for most shoppers. A 2025 survey by the American Spirits Council found that 68% of whiskey buyers could not identify the actual parent company behind their favorite brand. Even among self-described enthusiasts, fewer than 1 in 3 name the correct owner of Maker's Mark or Bullet. The idea of Kentucky bourbon being Japanese-owned or a Scottish label managed by a British multinational rarely registers at the checkout. This gap in understanding shapes the entire market. Heritage language and local imagery fill the labels, but the reality is a global network of ownership and investment. For many, the story on the bottle is more real than the facts behind it. The sense of national identity, of bourbon as an American tradition, scotch as a Scottish birthright, remains powerful even as the money flows elsewhere. Jennifer Lee, a consumer advocate, has spent years pushing for greater transparency. In 2026, she proposed a simple fix: a QR code on every whiskey bottle, linking directly to a public database of brand ownership and production details. Her idea gained traction with lawmakers frustrated by the patchwork of current labeling rules, but the industry response was muted. The big players have little incentive to make their control more visible. For shoppers, the question becomes unavoidable. How much of what you believe about your bottle is true? The answer for most is buried beneath layers of marketing and regulatory silence. Until ownership is as clear as age or proof, the illusion of independence will keep winning at the register. Today, a handful of corporations shape what whiskey means on the shelf and in the glass. As brand stories multiply, true independence becomes harder to spot and genuine diversity harder to taste. The real contest isn't between labels, but between perception and reality. Until transparency matches the marketing, every pour is a lesson in who truly decides what's authentic. What matters in your glass, heritage, or ownership? Let's hear your thoughts below.